Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. We've recently launched our Patreon page, which can be found at cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon. If you aren't familiar with Patreon, it's an easy way for those who are interested in this show to help out by simply pledging a small amount each month in sponsorship. Now that could be as little as $5 a month, which is about £3.80, or as much as you like. You will enable us to dedicate more time creating more content to help you, including videos, more blog posts, and even more shows. So if you can, head over to cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon and get involved. In this episode, we talk to Dave Follett, or as some of you may know him, as Super Good Dave. Dave is a husband and father of two. He's a software developer living in the Metro Detroit area with more than 18 years of professional experience. He's interested in continuous learning, tinkering, and exploring with new technology. Dave's pretty active away from technology, where he spends a lot of his time with other pursuits, including skiing, basketball, cooking, and fishing. So welcome to The Cynical Developer, Dave.
Thanks, James. I'm really honored to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to fit this in. And time zones are always an issue with this, because obviously I'm based in the UK and you're over in the States. So it's been good to finally get it pinned down.
Yeah, sounds good.
So we're going to dive straight in with our topic today. And what is a code review?
Well, code reviews are really just the process of looking at code line by line to look for errors, maybe provide some suggestions, and try to improve the overall code quality. Basically just have one person besides the author look at the code, and you really meet the criteria of a code review, which, it's just kind of a generic term in general.
So I guess it's helpful in the fact that it's like somebody with a fresh pair of eyes coming in and looking at the code and maybe interpreting requirements in a slightly different way that you have, to make sure that every case is covered by the code that you've written, and that you haven't done something silly in the code.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the more eyes you can get on the code, the better. The better the code's going to come out. And then there's also some additional benefits to code reviews, that it's a really great forum for learning, and so people have all kinds of different experience levels and different backgrounds. So it's really a good way for people to just be able to share ideas or pick up new tips. So
you were talking there about different experience levels and stuff like that. Who should be doing a code review? Is this something that a senior member of the team should be doing, or could a junior be doing it, or someone maybe that's not maybe a junior but more junior than I am? Could they be reviewing my code?
Really, code reviews are for everyone to do. It doesn't matter your experience level or whether you're a junior or a senior. Everyone's code can be improved, and there's always a new angle to look at it, or a different way, or a new method or technique, or a design pattern that you could apply. So it's really for everyone to do, and I would encourage everyone to do it.
Sure. I guess that comes back to one thing that I always tell people that I work with, is that there is no one single right way to do anything to solve any problem. There are definitely wrong ways to do it, but the way that I solve it may be different to the way that you solve it, but they're both as good or as efficient, or there may be one that's just slightly better in certain circumstances, and I guess you get that from these reviews.
Right, absolutely, and it's just a good way to get those discussions out, so that you can talk about it and talk about it in a group setting.
Sure. So do you need any particular software to do a code review?
I don't think so. The only tool I've ever really used is just a spreadsheet, and that's just to track the defects. So there's not much good if you don't, write them all down and then complete them. So that's pretty much what, in my experience, is just use a spreadsheet. But I will say that if your project has any type of automated tools like a linter or a spell checker, you should run those prior to entering the review, because it's just no point wasting people's time if you can knock out like spelling or formatting, coding styles type stuff ahead of time with a tool.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And spelling is something that I'm always getting pulled up on it. Actually, today I was talking to another member of the team who was complaining about some of the code he was working with for mine because there was spelling mistakes, and it made it very confusing for him. So having something in there like FX Cop and things like that to come in and check those is always good before you go and push any software changes out to anywhere. Stops you looking stupid, really.
Yeah, I've got quite a bit of experience where the comments are all extracted into a design document.
Okay.
And so everything really kind of matters at that point. You don't want to deliver your customer a document riddled with spelling errors or grammar mistakes and things. It just makes you look, not so professional.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a long time since I've done anything with pulling comments out to create documentation. But I totally agree that if you're pushing anything to the customer, even if you're building an API and they're going to have access to the Swagger pages, you don't want spelling mistakes in there.
Absolutely.
So, in my experience of code reviews, it's often that they've been based around a pull request through the version control system that you're using. Are pull requests really needed?
I think that's a great way to get a good look at all the code as it's coming into the system, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way to do it. But if you can, if you have that type of system and you have the time to be able to control commits or push pull requests as they come in, I think that's great. But I also think there's a lot of benefit to, outside of a pull request, plan for a review, like a module or a library or section of the code. Go ahead and plan out that you're going to review it and, build a team and do it outside of, a pull request. Because the pull request can be just, like you're looking at, tend to look at incremental changes or a bug fix, tiny type stuff. Whereas if you take an entire module, a library, and review that, you really can look at the whole thing as a whole. So you can get at more architectural type improvements, or looking at algorithm type improvements inside of it. So I think that's a great way to do it, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way. When you might want to do that and more stuff. Sure,
and I guess looking at the changes on a per commit basis, not just the full request, probably get you a better grasp of what changes have been made and why. Because one place that I worked a few years ago now, I introduced code reviews, but the way that the team committed their code to the repository was more of a big bang way rather than small incremental commits as they finish sections. So it was always very hard to do a code review with somebody, because it would end up us sitting down for hours at a time trawling through the 400 classes that they've committed and all the changes that they've made. And what we used to do was just focus on some specific areas. But I guess with doing smaller commits and having it behind pull requests and things, you could probably review all of the changes that they've done.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points.
So you mentioned about group settings. Who should be involved in a code review? Because in my experience, it's only ever been myself and another person, whether that was the person reviewing my code or I was reviewing their code?
Well, I think in that pull request, situation, I think that the author's not usually involved that much. But in sort of a more formal setting, which I have a bit more experience with the formal code reviews, is we actually build a team of 3 or more, and it always includes the author. And so essentially you have one person to conduct the review, the author of the code, and then at least one additional person to just review the code. And so in that setting, all 3 or more members review the code and then compile a list of defects. You do that offline, and then you consolidate that into one list, and then have a meeting, and then we will actually go through every defect one by one and discuss it, in that group, and then decide if it should be done now, done later, or deleted. And then once that meeting is completed, then you have a list of defects for the author to address. And then once the author has addressed all of the defects, then the moderator would then go through, which is the moderator is the person that's conducting. I don't remember if I use that term or not, but the person that conducts the meeting goes through and verifies that each defect is addressed. Okay. And then that sort of closes out the review, which is, it's a bit more formal, and it's certainly a lot more expensive. Depending on how much code you have and how much it takes each person to review the code, it can be quite a expensive or labor-intensive operation, but it can be really worth it.
Yeah. Doing it that way in a more formalized way definitely sounds more involved. So you would take all those defects that you found, if you found any, of course, and log them in your bug tracker, or would these be sort of an unofficial document that said, look, here's some problems, fix those, let's look at it again?
Yeah, from my experience, we just track it in a separate document. They don't there'd just be too many to enter into a bug track system, so we just track them like in a spreadsheet, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, because with my experience of it in the past, it's normally been that we would sort of sit and pair program it if there were issues. But again, I guess that's because it's down to a one-on-one situation. Now, the way that I've done it before is that when I'm there as the reviewer, is that I would go through the code without the person first. Then I would sit with them and get them to explain it to me, and then sort of compare notes a little bit to say, well, this is how I read that it does that. And if there are any discrepancies between how I think the code works and how they think the code works, we can sort that out. And maybe I got it wrong, maybe they got it wrong, I guess, and that'll pull something out of the review in a positive light.
Yeah. Do you in that sort of setup, did you address the defects right there, or did you just sort of note them and then come back to it?
Yeah, we tend to actually fix the code there and then, and then push that into the repository, just as another commit, with a comment explaining what we'd fixed. We didn't note it down and do it away from the meeting or as like bug tracking issues, as I mentioned.
Right.
So the group review is something I've not really thought about. Not doing it that way. So it's pretty interesting way to do it. But as you say, it's very labor intensive because you're then taking 3 developers time to go and look at it.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you necessarily would apply like to the entire code base, or maybe not even every project, but there are definitely some types of projects or some areas of a project that it can really have a benefit. If you're working on something that's safety critical, like in your machine learning podcast just recently, you were talking about automated cars. I assume that they're doing a lot of formal group code reviews with a similar type process.
Yeah.
But also if you have maybe you have a piece of really important code that has to be very performant, then that could be a good thing to review like this, because then you can really get multiple minds on it. I've been a part of reviews that have been, I think, up to 5 or 6 people. So they it just depends on what you're trying to do and what your objectives of the review are.
Sure. I guess it must get quite difficult with that number of people in, because as developers, we're quite opinionated people, and having 6 people look at code, I'm sure 6 people could come up with 6 different opinions on how it should be done.
Yeah, that definitely can happen, and in that sort of setting, the moderator or the person conducting the review, they're usually trained to try and handle conflict. It's important to note that any code review should be like a very safe environment. You shouldn't feel scared to voice your opinion, and there shouldn't be any personal attacks. It should be really an environment for learning and making things better. And so so everyone should have that in mind, and then it's sort of the moderator's job to to keep some of that stuff in check. But I haven't had any experience with things getting out of hand. Yeah.
And the safe haven that you talk about is definitely a point that I think the listeners should take on board, because I know in the past when I've had to have my code reviewed, there is that trepidation that, what are they going to find now? Because they'll always pull something out, and is it going to look negative on me? But I guess that's not what it's really for. It's not what or why we need them.
Yeah, no, it's not. And another thing is these type of reviews should not factor into like your performance reviews or raises or any of that stuff. All that stuff should be sort of set aside so that you can go into this area and really just focus on peer-to-peer learning and making the code better. Sure. And one other thing that I want to bring up real quick about some of the larger reviews that I've been a part of. Sometimes you can be assigned a viewpoint for the review. So maybe you might have 5 or 6 people in the review, but every person might have a different viewpoint. So like a different area or different type of focus. So like one person might be focused on performance, and so they're really looking at that, and they're sort of not getting bogged down with other types of things in the code.
I quite like that, because you can't be an expert in all areas, so bringing in people that have got an interest or an expertise in particular parts of a system to review the code is that's a really good idea. I like that. Yeah,
and kind of along with that too is the makeup of the team usually is assembled based on the the type of code and what you're trying to get out of the code. So if you're if you have some Python code, you might bring someone with a lot of Python experience, or conversely, you might bring someone with no Python experience in as a way for them to kind of come up to speed on the language. You might add them. Maybe you only need 3 people, but you want to bring someone else up to speed. You might add that 4th person on, because it's a really great way to look at the code and then hear the defects, and even the people with the least amount of experience in these reviews will come up with some of the best defects or changes.
Yeah, I guess because they're not tainted and disfigured like some of us that have been doing it for a long while. So they look at it with a different viewpoint.
Sometimes it's just a question. Hey, I don't understand this, and then everyone else around the room can be like, oh, that's this crazy advanced technique of this language. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that because it doesn't really add anything into the code, but make it hard for new people to come up to speed on it.
Sure. Yeah. So when you're working on a project that has a more formal code review process, is this something that every change gets reviewed, or is it just a sample of the changes that get reviewed?
Well, it's really more about picking the time to review a chunk of code. Like, it's not like the pull requests kind of come in sequentially, and I can see where you're keeping your eye on things. The formal code review is more about like, okay, we got this new section of code that we're bringing into the system. Let's we know that in advance, so we're going to plan for it, and then but picking the right time to review that chunk can be tricky, because if you do it too early, you're not very efficient because you're fixing all kinds of things that shouldn't be in the review. And then if you do it too late, then everyone's going to be reluctant to make architectural changes and to it. So it's really hard to find that. It can be tricky to find that sweet spot.
Yeah. I think the example I was thinking of is that you wouldn't have somebody sit down and go, right, I'm going to write an API, I'm going to write a translation layer to that, I'm going to do a UI, I'm going to do an admin system to it, and then that's all that feature complete. You wouldn't wait until all 4 of those sections are done. You would do them when the API is complete, when the middle section is complete, when the customer UI is done, when the admin UI is done. You would do them in those staged reviews, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say it would depend, or the answer you always get, but I guess it would depend on how you're developing it and how much code that would be. I could see where you might want to review something like in totality like that, but if it becomes too big, then you have to split that into separate reviews.
Yep.
So I can see that either way, or you can. I don't have as much experience doing this, but I've talked about it with some colleagues, or about reviewing the interfaces across those areas. Do all those, review that just as the interfaces, and then come back when the implementations are put to those interfaces, and then review those at the next round.
Yeah, I have done a similar thing where the seniors of the team, we sat around, decided what the implementations would look like, the interfaces, what the variable names were, what the domain specific language was, and not such that it was the domain of the actual business, but the domain of what we were trying to achieve. And that worked quite well, although we did spend many hours discussing it. And I think I can't remember the exact object that I'm about to name, but I'm sure it was along the lines of passenger, which, to call a model that, seems completely absurd. But in the context of what we were doing, it made perfect sense. It could have been something like passenger. But anyway, it's one of those big problems for developers, and it's naming stuff.
Yeah. I sit just staring at what I'm and just staring at it like, what am I going to name this? What am I going to name this? When it's easy to rename it, so just name it anything.
Yeah. You're sitting there thinking, do I call it a factory? Do I call it a builder? Is it a maker? Is it a gas? What does it actually do? And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and you tack controller, manager, everything with an on the end, and it's like none of these words matter.
Yeah, just call it utility and move on.
Well, that's too long. You just got to call it utils.
Yeah. So when I've carried out reviews and when I've had them carried out on my code, it always feels like you have to find something that's wrong with the code. Is that always the way, or is it possible to have a review and go, no, everything is fine, this looks great?
I've never been in a review that came back with nothing, but I can definitely remember pressures like when I was earlier in my career, like, oh, did I find enough defects? What are people going to think of my defects versus everyone else's defects? Because in that formal process, you go away and you review it on your own, and then they all get consolidated in. And once they're consolidated in, no one can tell who has 20, 50, or 100 defects to it. So I don't know. I mean, there's always something to find, but you shouldn't go. You should only bring something up if it's important, and you shouldn't keep looking just because you haven't found something, and then you shouldn't bring up something trivial or that's not really worth it, either. So
yeah, sure. So you mentioned earlier about if the code review is too big, do you time box these reviews? So if they get to a certain point, you go, well, that's it, that's done. We need to move on, or do they just sort of grow naturally and they take as long as they take?
Typically, based on the code size, there's usually a metric that's used to assign an expected review time for when each person's independently reviewing it. So it kind of gives you a guideline of I should spend about this many hours. If you're going over a little bit or under a little bit, it's not a big deal.
Sure. Okay, so I guess the biggest takeaway from this episode is the fact that code reviews, they're not there to chastise you. They're not there to pull you up on your failings as a developer, or pointing out the fact that you're not that good a developer because everyone else in the team has spotted flaws with your code that you didn't see. It's all about making that end product more robust, more maintainable, and give it longevity. And I think one of the good points that we did make as well is the fact that we're going to simplify code so that anybody new to the team can understand it. Because there is that old adage that when I wrote this code, only myself and God knew what it did, and now only God knows.
Yep, and the only thing really to add to that would be just how much peer-to-peer learning is conducted, and I would tell you the best role to have in this is the author, because it can also be the scariest role if you're not used to going through the sort of that type of process, but you're going to come out learning the most. Sure,
and don't go in there playing the victim, because it's there to help everybody.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we'll wrap up there, I think, and I'd just like to thank you for coming on and talking about code reviews with me today.
Thanks a lot, James. I really feel honored as a listener from nearly the beginning of your podcast. So I do really feel honored to be asked to be on.
Yeah, it's not a problem at all. It's been enjoyable talking to you about it, and it's cleared up a few things that I wasn't aware of. So it's been good. And just a reminder to everyone out there listening, there is still time left to enter the 100th episode swag giveaway. If you're listening to this on release day, that is. To find out how to enter that competition, then do go back and listen to episode 100. And next week, the winner will be announced. So until then, thank you for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm Jim Studott, and you've been listening to Dave Follett talking about code. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.